Welcome to Leadership Comes Alive, brought to you by Leadershape Global. This is the show that will help you develop transpersonal leadership skills that improve business relationships and results. Learn to lead beyond the ego and bring about better performing, sustainable organizations. Accelerated learning in a virtual environment will make sure your leadership comes alive.
Hello everyone, this is Danielle Grant from Leadershape Global. Thank you for being with us today. And joining me today is Xenia Angevin. Xenia is a Leadershape faculty member. She's a psychological coach using positive psychology approaches, a coach mentor, negotiation expert, and a change consultant with an international client base. Some of the highlights of her background include senior roles at the BBC, where she traveled widely around EMEA, Asia, Russia, Latin America, and also with Bloomberg Media. And subsequently, Xenia held leadership roles working for Her Majesty the Queen at Buckingham Palace, including as head of research and head of government liaison in the diplomacy unit. She's a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group at the EMCC, a member of Coaching Psychology and Transpersonal Psychology Special Interest Groups at the British Psychological Society. So that's quite a background for Xenia, which it puts you in a really great position to talk to us today about diversity and inclusion. So today what we're going to do is to explore and discover some new insight about diversity inclusion and why unconscious bias training is not the answer. And this is a clue as to what is different about how transpersonal leader views it. So Xenia, thank you for being with us and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction, Danielle, and I'm delighted to be here.
So, Xenia, my first question is, clearly you've spent a lot of time looking at this topic. How did you first become interested in the subject?
Well, looking back, I've been interested in the subject for a long time. When I did my law degree back in 2000s, early 2000s, I specialized in the philosophy of law, jurisprudence, which is where the concepts of human rights, ethics, morality, equality, liberty, justice are explored. And later on, when I did my MBA, I reflected on my concern for the fullest inclusion of everybody into the higher education. Of course, at the time, as on the regular, the campus-based study excluded lots of people. They leave their homes for a number of reasons, including medical conditions, caring responsibilities, disability, childcare. And, I thought that that large section of society needs to have as much opportunity to engage in the transformation as anybody else. At the time, it wasn't that fashionable. So now in 2021, the entire planet has to do that, has to access higher education and other learning online. Interestingly, the other day I came across a concept called nominative determinism, and that's where the people are likely to in the occupations which fit their names. And it made me reflect on my name, actually, and it has two meanings in Greek. One is the hospitable friendship, and another one is the foreigner or the other. And I think it'll be fair to say that I've spent most of my life either being a guest or a foreigner, the other, or learning about the ways to include the other into an organization, a group or relationship. And I think that's really important because in our days of global frights and terror, emanating from a virus or a human agent, the other is often seen as a threat to our safety or a competitor to be overcome in the struggle for the scarce resources. And yet, if you look at the holy texts, if you look at spiritual writings, and just simple humanistic values, they call on us to welcome strangers, actually, and to build relationship with those who are distant from us.
So it sounds as if you've had the experience of building those bridges and getting included in new societies and new approaches. And it's interesting that you talk about the virus there, because I suspect that's one simple exclusion from the idea about welcoming strangers into our midst.
Very much so.
So on a more serious note, what is diversity? How do we understand it and identify it?
We can talk of different types, and there isn't one definition. I find it useful to distinguish between the acquired and inherent diversity, where the acquired diversity consists of experiences, learned behaviors, learned traits. Some of them are self-selected, and the others come about by chance, really. And inherent diversity includes the fundamental attributes, which we know very well, I think, from legislation, because many of them are part of our identity diversity, and that is the race, age, physical qualities, that includes a neurological profile, gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. I think many scholars look at personality and behavioral diversity, and at work, cognitive diversity is really important. Which is the difference in information, knowledge, representations, mental models, heuristics available to a group of people or to an individual. I really like the author Scott Page, who talks about it quite a lot. And identity diversity actually, together with acquired diversity, is a contributor to those differences, to cognitive differences. But I think for the time being, it's good to leave them separate.
So we hear so much about diversity and inclusion these days, and obviously our remit is to talk about people that are running organizations, because not only do they have a huge amount of power in society these days, but it's where we see a great many examples of the value or lack of diversity and inclusion. So is it always good for an organization? There's situations where maybe it's not.
Well, I'd say inclusion is always good for business, but it's also underpinned by the equality and justice imperatives. So it's always good for business from many perspectives. I think in many organizations we have the diversity, but we don't have the inclusion, and that's really important. In the 6 primary identity categories I outlined, I think 2 are worth highlighting, especially the race and the gender, because the implicit biases we'll talk about a bit later related to these categories appear to form very, very early in one's life. And these differences became especially evident in the pandemic, which saw the Black, the Asian and ethnic minorities populations really suffering from COVID-19 in disproportionate measure. And of course, that sent the geneticists scrambling for the gene responsible for that. Whereas the answer, as we found, wasn't just in the genes, but it was in the socioeconomic picture, which is where these days the different parts of population don't have the same access to opportunities which allow for socioeconomic flourishing, I'm afraid. And generally speaking, with my law and psychology background, I always feel it's important to get the key definitions right. Bias, prejudice, stereotyping, they're all different things. And I'm not normally overly pedantic, as you know me, but I've been slightly anxious since the episode when the UK central government department suspended all of internal implicit bias training. Because it was thought that such training did not reduce the implicit bias. In my view, part of the problem was that the definitions were muddled. No one in good faith could have promised an intervention to overcome an effect which has evolved through the millennia of evolution, and also is there due to developmental factors, which crystallize very early in life. As an example, I recently looked into the other race bias effect, which means that we recognize our own race faces far better and faster from the age of 3 months. And there's a similar face bias for females who are recognized as nurturers from the same age. and that bias may influence those we see as part of our circle or outside of our circle. And I think that's really important now, because most of our life is online and faces is all we see. So we're even more likely to be implicitly biased. I think, however, while we may not be able to shift that bias very quickly, we must become aware of it. And we must avoid the prejudice that may result from that. And we should avoid the formation of stereotypes through conscious practice. And I've seen it done. I think that leaders with transpersonal values that we talk about think very positively about people's intentions when setting out to improve diversity and inclusion in organizations and elsewhere. So we always start from assuming that no one is deliberately biased or is set out to discriminate, but we often are not aware of the implicit biases that we have inherited.
To be successful in today's challenging business environment, everyone needs to be a leader. And great teams depend on leaders who lead beyond the ego, bring values to full consciousness, and inspire a performance-enhancing culture. The Transpersonal Leadership Training Program from Leadershape Global is available to individual leaders looking to develop their skills and behaviors for optimal results, or to groups and teams looking to take performance to the next level. Develop yourself and become the kind of transpersonal leader needed for the post-COVID world, or empower a whole team to improve their leadership competence. Find out more at leadershapeglobal.com.
That's an interesting point, and whilst it's on a much lighter scale, everybody knows that in order to be healthy, you need a balanced diet. But that doesn't mean to say you always like all those foods equally. You either acquire a taste for them because you know it's going to make you healthier, or you live a less healthy life.
Absolutely. So yes, exactly. And with the same analogy, it's very important to be aware of what this implicit bias means, whether it's for food or for a face, for a race, anything else in our lives, and how it manifests itself. I think in order for the organizational culture to be inclusive, we need to go way beyond that awareness. And for those listening who are emerging leaders, one doesn't have to wait long, really, before becoming a diversity and inclusion change agent. In culture change, I think role modeling of inclusion practices is generative at all levels of organization. And perhaps on a bigger scale, we can minimize the danger of prejudice by working towards the socioeconomic equality we spoke about across all nations, and by improving intergroup relations at our level.
So you talked a little bit now about race and how, as babies, we tend to perceive our caregivers, whatever they may look like, as being the primary focus and our understanding of what a caring relationship represents in terms of a human face. What about gender differences, sort of quite apart from that?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting factor to look into. And I looked into the Leadershape paper recently, which actually spoke about differences in gender and the way in which females come across, and there were the results in there which showed that women scored way better in transpersonal leadership competencies. Women scored better than men, apart from I think one or two categories, and one of them was self-confidence. And I found that really interesting because every time it seems we come up with a new refined concept of leadership fit for the modern day, for the challenges that we have today, women score higher than men. And I've seen very similar findings across several studies looking into transformational or humanistic leadership, for example. And intriguingly, this doesn't translate into female leadership in numbers. I'd also say that women not scoring highly on self-confidence in the 360s, it should not be interpreted on its face value. really, because beyond having the executive presence or being decisive, these figures may mean that the environment we're in, unfortunately, is not yet ready to see women as senior leaders. And that is unfortunate. And it is a reflection of the very archaic social conditioning where women and leadership are not compatible, which of course belongs to the past. Still, though, the gendered social conditioning is not the only factor at play. I think when it comes to genders, and if I could say something slightly controversial, it seems that women do not want exactly the same thing as men want. And in my career, I've observed institutions and organizations working on allowing women to be the same, be the same what a man wants to be. Whereas we need to enable a plurality of choices in leadership and elsewhere, really. Marissa Orr, who worked for Google and Facebook, she writes about this really beautifully in her book, which is called Lean Out. And so, therefore, a good question could be, what is the model of leadership that would appeal to more women?
And that's a really great question, Xenia, and it's something that I've never heard any group of senior leaders discuss in all my years in corporate life and even since. So what other evidence points to women and men being different that has a bearing on this discussion?
Well, there do seem to be important ways in which men and women are different, and that's very much supported by social, cognitive, and gender psychology. So, for example, Simon Baron-Cohen did an experiment where he measured the traits of empathy and pattern thinking, which was originally designed actually to look into neurodiversity. And he found in that sample that more women scored high on empathy and more men scored high on pattern thinking, for example. So I'd say that scientifically speaking, that these and the other experiments do not show that men and women are the same. So therefore, they serve as evidence that there is that difference. However, I think more importantly, it's the conception of leadership, which needs to be reviewed to fully include both feminine and masculine traits, because both are very beneficial, and we should overcome the legacy of the outdated evolutionary logic in the fact that the brain evolves very slowly, and through knowing the information and practicing, and thanks to neuroplasticity, we can proactively rewire our brains, I believe, and we develop different ways of understanding leadership practices.
So this ability for us to focus our thinking and rewire our brains allows our brains to evolve and change more rapidly. But of course, we have to start with awareness from what you've clearly laid out. So you mentioned the 6 primary identity difference categories. What else matters?
That's a very good question, because we, of course, can see some differences, but the other are not observable, especially now that we live online. So more expansive categories would include culture, neighborhoods, family structure, a diet even, social norms, socioeconomic status we spoke about, education, genes, religion, ancestry, language, dialect. And talking about dialects, certainly in the UK, the accent and the sentence structure and speech give significant clues to the person's ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, their education. So basically, I would say that it signals your tribe, and it puts you inside or outside of a given group in split seconds. So it can be potentially very non-inclusive. It can have a non-inclusive effect.
Are you an executive coach and need to take your practice to the next level? Now you can by becoming an ICF accredited transpersonal leadership coach. Brought to you by Leadershape Global, Transpersonal Leadership Coach Training is an intensive learning program designed to differentiate your coaching practice. Learn to work with leaders so they can create performance-enhancing, caring, ethical, and sustainable cultures through being a transpersonal leader. And give your practice some TLC that will make a difference. Find out more at leadershapeglobal.com. That's leadershapeglobal.com.
And I'm sure that that's not just a UK phenomena, because having studied at an American university, I became very familiar and had an ear for the different socioeconomic and makeup of East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. And similarly, when I was working in France, I developed that same ability. So it may be more pronounced in the UK, but I do believe that that's quite common around the world. So we're talking about how a transpersonal leader might approach this. How might they do it? What tips would allow anyone to start to address these issues?
Well, I'll try to give a couple of tips. So I think first, a transpersonal leader appreciates that every person is unique. There are no types. Everybody is very much unique. And we also think that diversity attributes, therefore, cannot be separated because they also connect. And you'll see that within any category of diverse individuals, we'll still find a diverse group of people. So, for example, if you take a group of women, there'll still be racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, ability, cognitive diversity within that group. So my tips are to begin to consider and adopt the transpersonal leadership mindset, really. And a transpersonal leader feels the need for both business rationality, because that's really important, and transpersonal values. Transpersonal is the way beyond the person, and it's beyond the personality alone. So it has I'd say, relational, a systemic vision as well. And it's also about philosophy and spirituality, and may I say, the magic of life and serendipity of life. That's beautiful. It's very much about the philosophical notions of freedom and responsibility, you know, the very existential way. It's about the meaning of life and what change you feel it is your purpose to bring, and what are your virtues, what are your personal character strengths. And of course, I did mention evolution a couple of times. So a word has to be said about the evolutionary theory. The transpersonal leader is not oblivious. So he or she understands the evolutionary roots that the human has developed, but we act in a more humanistic, elevated conscious way, which is geared for ethics, for equality and equity. So we're looking ahead rather than backwards, if that makes sense. And in the online world, today I thought one of the benefits is that we are actually more likely to experience indirect contact with those who are very different from us, because we all study, we attend international conferences online, we do lots of webinars online, we go on LinkedIn more and more. And simply said, in the online environment, you can't just make a beeline towards your in-group, as we used to have done. In the circumstances where the Zoom just assigns you to a random breakout room, so indirect contact as well as direct contact works well in forging diversity and inclusion across all groups, and it's a good start anyway. And as a committed technologist, I really think that technology is the diversity and inclusion enabler. So I think, to sum up, in the current world, you will for sure experience being seen as divergent, the other, the minority, much more often, because we move workplaces, we move geographies, and even if virtually. So I would invite you to use this experience to guide you to do all you can to improve diversity and inclusion, because it is a real win-win for everyone concerned.
Thank you, Xenia. That's a fascinating discussion on diversity and inclusion, and it's something we're going to take into a slightly different direction away from ethnicity and gender next time we meet. So that's all for today's episode of Leadership Comes Alive. I'd like to thank Xenia Angevin for being with us today, and thank you all for listening. Until next time, when we'll be extending this conversation into some new arenas about how a transpersonal leader creates an inclusive organization, especially in relation to less prominent areas such as neurodiversity. This is Danielle Grant from Leadershape Global.
You have been listening to Leadership Comes Alive, brought to you by Leadershape Global. Join us next time as we continue to explore transpersonal leadership skills that bring about better performing, sustainable organizations. We'll talk with you next time on Leadership Comes Alive. Visit leadershapegglobal.com.